All right, no further ado. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this On Think Tanks event on narrative change in research. Delighted to be here, and I'm going to introduce our panel shortly. We've got two great speakers who are going to talk a little bit more about this. But I'll just kick off by introducing myself and my co-host Isabel. And then we'll sort of go into a little bit more background. Now, can everybody hear me okay? There's no issues on that side. Thumbs up around, brilliant. So, first I have Isabel Crabtree-Condor, who is my co-host and a knowledge broker on narratives and civic space. She's part Brit, part Peruvian, and the author of this fantastic publication that you're probably going to hear quite a bit about today, on narrative power and collective action, which On Think Tanks published just over in the recent couple of months. You may well already have seen it, but if you haven't, do check it out. We will put it into the chat a bit later on, so you can just click straight on that. I'm Caroline Cassidy. I am a strategic communications advisor working around evidence, ideas, and how to get that into policy, and also obviously narrative change. And I'm an associate for On Think Tanks. So to sort of go into the topic of today's chat, I mean, I think we see this very much as a kind of informal session. As in, we'd love people to pitch in later on. We don't want this just to be us talking at you. We really want to get some ideas together and sort of look at ways forward. So this event really sort of came together on the back of these two publications that have just come out by On Think Tanks and Oxfam on narrative change and collective action. And actually, what was interesting about them is that they feature a whole range of voices from across a whole range of sectors, anything from NGOs to fashion to media, advertising, academia, talking about narrative change, what it means for them, what can be done, how we can take this forward. And we do actually have some of the authors in the room, which is fantastic. I'm seeing them there. And then, so I've been very fascinated by this topic for a long time, and it was linked to that publication that actually I subsequently decided to write a blog. Again, we can pop that in the chat later, which pulls together some of the key dimensions of narrative change. And really what I was trying to do was condense how anyone that wants to work on this topic can actually take it and hopefully try and think about it more or put it into their work. In a blog, there's not that much space, but also particularly targeting think tanks, research institutes, researchers, staff in think tanks who have been thinking about whether this is something that they want to do more on, they should do something more on. So that's the kind of background from me, and I think it's particularly important to think about how think tanks and research institutes could get better at embedding this. Particularly, to this very critical time that we're all probably banging on about all the time, where, we're facing some really, really tough challenges right now in terms of social change and looking for positive outcomes. Maybe it's a bit of a buzzword. I don't know, that's something we can discuss today. I mean, I know that in last week we had a Twitter chat on this very topic. And again, that's something else you might want to have a look at if you haven't. And one of the participants in that, Brett Davison from the Open Societies Foundation, who's done a lot of work on narrative change, he said that this used to be seen as one of those things that civil society and NGOs and advocacy had sort of focused on. But now he really sees it as it's a sector coming into its own. And that's what we need to look into today. So think tanks and research institutes could play more of a role in injecting ideas and evidence into unpicking, rewiring of narratives, particularly at a time when there's lots of competing voices, all shouting at once, broadcasting. Well, so where do think tanks and researchers fit in? So the questions of today really are, what is the role of researchers and think tanks in contributing to narrative change? And within that discussion, we want to particularly look at some of the biggest barriers. So why, there's pockets of work happening here and there. Some people are doing it really well, some people are not doing it very much at all, or if at all. What's stopping them from doing it? And crucially, should they even be doing it in the first place? And if they do, how best to do it? So we really want to also push the session to come up with kind of some ways forward, some solutions. And just to whet your appetite, really, when we're thinking of kind of some of the barriers that I've heard over the years, but also particularly recently, and in the Twitter chat, is things like, is it the fact that there's not enough financing or resources for this, or is that just a lazy excuse? Is it the short-termist nature of projects and programs? This work, narrative change work, takes a long time. It needs collaboration, it needs a lot of effort. And do we have the right incentives in place in the first place for that? Is it because narrative change work is just plain challenging, and so it's just easy to ignore it, do something else, tick boxes, get it done? Or is it about the role of think tanks and research institutes, research and think tank neutrality? Maybe it's that, is it seen to be too political, too sensitive, too emotional? And is it that kind of age-old issue of it's not really the remit of researchers? Let's focus on facts, evidence, research. But narratives, isn't this just another way of talking about comms and storytelling? Let's not worry about it. And I guess finally, the other thing that comes up a lot is the issue of audience. Who do you focus your energy on? Who is the priority audience? Is it, do you focus on the opposing side? Do you focus on those on side, those in the middle? And finally, what about the general public? Not traditionally a strong focus group, for think tanks at least. So lots of food in there to whet your appetite. And obviously going to some more great thoughts coming through soon from our panel, who I'm delighted to introduce. First up, we have Enrique Mendizabal, who probably most of you know. He's director and founder of On Think Tanks, and Enrique has been doing a lot of work thinking about think tanks research and evidence-informed policymaking for a long time. Formerly head of programme at the Research and Policy and Development Programme at the UK-based think tank ODI. And he also has done a lot of work around evidence and Evidence Week in Peru itself. We were also going to have joining us from the Ford Foundation, but unfortunately she had to pull out at the last minute due to personal reasons. And finally, but I would suggest, sorry, that's what I was going to say, I would suggest that you perhaps go and have a look at her conversation in the publication, the narrative publication, because a really interesting perspective on what's happening in Mexico right now and the work she's doing there. And last but not least, we have Krizna Gomez, who's a human rights lawyer, a narrative researcher, and the former director of programs and a lead facilitator labs, a global innovation space for social change actors. Okay, I won't take up any more of your time. I'm going to hand over to my co-host Isabel, who's going to talk a bit more about today's discussion, and then our speakers, and then we will open up to the rest of you to bring your ideas to the table.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to talk a little bit just to kind of ground our conversation so we have a collective understanding of what it is that we're discussing. And also just ask you to refer to the chat, and there's some really interesting definitions that people are sharing of what, well, maybe not definitions, but what narratives means to them. And the reason that we're asking that question is that sometimes it can feel like narratives are the sort of the purview of experts, and actually we are all in one way or another reinforcing or reshaping narratives on a daily basis through our work already. So the question I want to pose a little bit is, can we do that more consciously? So what I've seen so far, having talked to a couple of people who are in either research institutes or in think tanks, there's a lot of diversity when it comes to how think tanks engage or contribute to narratives. We've heard that often this can be seen as the work of communication, so part of the storytelling arena, aka someone else's job. But I really want you to think, zoom out from your day-to-day as individuals, as part of bigger institutions, and ask you to start thinking about how the knowledge that you have could be contributing to storytelling at scale on big issues like society, the economy, or big ideas and ideals like diversity and inequality. So it's perhaps not news to you, but maybe worth saying anyway, that contributing towards and amplifying new inclusive narratives is also one of the ways that we can collectively support positive change in society. So as Caroline mentioned, I've been speaking to and learning from people looking at narratives from really different angles. So perspectives, disciplines, industries, neuroscientists, activists, marketing people, journalists, social movement leaders, researchers, and so on. And what's emerged from all of their work, the sort of the red thread, if you like, is that narratives are a form of power. And I want to share a couple of ideas about this, which I think will help us with a discussion about opportunities and challenges for thinking about how think tanks can engage and collaborate on narratives for social change. So what is narrative power and how does it work? So for me, and this emerges from a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years, this research that we've been engaged in, narratives are the many, many stories that exist around us that help us to make sense of the world. So whilst narratives are known, they're sort of, and versus stories being told, they're kind of what we think of as common sense. So you can try to imagine the challenges involved in trying to shift what is known about some of these huge topics, like the environment or equality. And the reason that narratives are so powerful is that they act as activators, as sort of shortcuts, if you like, hidden code for our brains. And we're probably all familiar with this idea that we're hardwired for stories and the larger narratives that they feed into. And we see a lot of evidence of these systems being hijacked or hacked by anti-rights movements, populists, to instill fear and spread hatred using us versus them narratives. So narratives can be used to divide and isolate, but also to mobilize and connect people. So, for example, the ones I mentioned before, so the us versus them narratives, or narratives like change is possible and you can be part of it. Narratives also shape what we think of as normal and what is possible. So they can, in practice, actually help keep ideas about what is possible locked in place, which I think is a really interesting kind of starting point for the discussion we're going to have. But they can also open the possibilities for doing things differently. So, for example, the narrative that we can continue to exploit the environment sort of infinitely, or we need to find ways to live within our planetary boundaries. So one final thing about narratives is that they are powerful and dynamic, and they often lurk below the surface, a little bit like deep ocean currents. And this is important because they are a little bit outside of our sphere of influence, individually and also even collectively. So really thinking about how we need to bridge different industries if we want to make change at that sort of level. So they're powerful, they're about power, they're not always visible, but they're creating waves at the surface. And the good news, I guess, which I just want to sort of leave you with, so it's not all scary and too big to kind of to think about how we might influence this arena, is that just as narratives are about power, power is also not static. So narratives, as I said at the beginning, can be reinforced, reshaped, or challenged. And I think that's where it gets really interesting. So I'm going to hand over to Kike to share some initial reflections to get our discussion going, related to his own perspective on this topic. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Isabel. Can you hear me okay? Yes, good. Sometimes when I switch from mute, it doesn't work well. So I have some notes here. I'm going to try to connect this to kind of think tanks and my reflection on three main ideas. One, that narratives are important for think tanks because they can affect the context in which they operate. They can affect them, and it can affect what they can do. The second, that narrative development or change or protection of narratives is a strategy that think tanks pursue or can pursue. And three, and taking into account something that Ruth Levine said in our opening remarks yesterday, they have important consequences on many people, often on on very vulnerable people. So the first thing I would say is think tanks sometimes like to say that they go wherever the evidence takes them. They try to present themselves to gain trust. They present themselves as being neutral. I mean, I've always argued that's clearly not true. Nobody is neutral, certainly not when you're dealing with issues of public interest. But they might be able to get away with this when you look at individual outputs, like individual reports here and there. You not necessarily connect them. When you start to look at their arguments over a long period of time, arguments that individual researchers communicate, develop, and share, or the organizations themselves, you start to see these narratives emerging, and you see that the narratives are filled with concepts that are very charged with emotion, politics, interests, with ethics and morals and beliefs, etc. So clearly not neutral. And as Isabel just said, they are a form of power. And so how can narratives affect think tanks? They can certainly affect the funding agendas, research funding agendas, that might follow a certain narrative, a certain view of the world, and that is the view of the world that gets funded. They can affect the appreciation that policymakers or the public might have for evidence, the value of evidence in society and the value of evidence in decision-making. They can affect think tanks on credibility. They might be perceived by others as being in this narrative, being part of a narrative, being outside of that narrative, being kind of opposing a narrative that they might believe in, they might accept. And a narrative might actually affect who wants to work for a particular think tank. You might look at the think tank with from a different perspective if you are looking at the world through a certain narrative. And as Isabel just said as well, they are shortcuts. And I think that, and here's where I think, it's sort of particularly important in the way think tanks use narratives, is that they can oversimplify complexity. They can reduce, what needs to be sometimes a very nuanced, complicated, difficult public debate on very difficult issues into, few issues alone. And that might have the consequence of limiting policy options. Right? So if you understand that you have complexity and you have to deal with it, you might consider every possibility. But if you are now dealing with a much simpler view of the world, a model, and we economists would like to think about, and your options might be more limited. Second point is that think tanks do use narratives as a strategy to pursue their objectives. They might use a narrative of too much regulation to argue for certain policy recommendations and incorporate this narrative into everything they do, into the choice of studies, into the choice of methods, and into the recommendations and who they talk to. They might talk about inefficient government instead of an unfair government, for example, and therefore focusing our attention on one aspect of public policy, which has consequences in the type of reforms that would follow. And the third thing that I think is important to consider, and this leads me to a bit of a challenge to ourselves, is that narratives have, as I said, important consequences, important real-life consequences, right? They can affect the allocation of resources. They can affect and they can mobilize people to protest, like we're seeing now in Peru, for example. They can embolden, empower repression, and many other behaviors at the personal, organizational, or institutional level that can be, supported by a prevailing narrative or by a desire to fight that narrative. So let me challenge ourselves a little bit, and this relates to a session I was listening to just now, led by INASP, which is about sort of the playing field and how equitable, how leveled up it is. And narratives, they can be created, they can be defended, they can be changed by people. And sometimes some of us, institutions like maybe OTT, maybe Oxfam, foundations, large NGOs, large think tanks, and globally other actors, we tend to choose individuals over others. We tend to choose them to be representative of something, a group, a country, a discipline. Right? So we have a researcher from Malawi here on our panel, this researcher must represent all Malawians. Right? So we take their views to represent a larger group. We tend to do this because they tend to be our colleagues, our peers. We have good networks with them, connections with them. But by doing this, I think we are imposing certain narratives over others and not necessarily being informed enough about the power dynamics of competing narratives at a local level, or even at a regional level or a global level. So I think it's a challenge to us, right? They are important. They are a form of power. They affect all of us. We can use them, but I think we should be using them aware that by supporting a particular narrative, which might make sense to us, we might be imposing that narrative on others who might not agree with it. We might have very valid reasons not to agree with it, but we might not know enough about those reasons and about those dynamics. And I think think tanks working at the national level, think tanks working at the regional and global level need to be conscious of that responsibility in how they use narratives. It's not a storytelling exercise. I don't think it's just a new communication gimmick. I think it's an issue of power, of very strong power. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Enrique. Shall we hand over to Krizna now to give her thoughts on the topic?
Hi, yeah. Thanks, Caroline. Are you hearing me fine? Yeah, perfect. So Enrique focused on why narratives are important to think tanks. I will focus on what think tanks can contribute to narrative change, and perhaps to let you in on where I'm coming from on this issue. So I'm a human rights lawyer who used to work in a think tank. So in Bogota, in Colombia. So it's a think tank. We do academic research, rigorous academic research, but we also mix it with activism. So we were litigating, doing campaigns, doing work in communities, etc. And it was in that environment where I basically saw the microcosm of the situation we are in with respect to think tanks and narratives, where we had one half of the organization producing the evidence, doing the research, and they would go to the communicators. And I was there when we first hired our communications officer, and then they became a team of communicators. And we had them just to put a spin and launch the reports that we came up with, those thick books, etc., that we were publishing. And I have found since that is still how people in the social change field, particularly activists, see the role of narratives. There's not much of an appreciation of that interaction between the world of evidence and research and analytical work with the work of narrative building, which I think is really a missed opportunity. So after I left that think tank in Bogota, like what Caroline mentioned, I worked for a social innovation space that was aimed to help activists around the world see their issues in a multidisciplinary way. So we ran, along with Thomas Coombs, whom I see is here, we ran a series of narrative labs around the world that was aimed at coming up with narrative ideas in different contexts that were undergoing attacks against civil society. And the way that we put those together was to really deliberately find people who are coming from the think tanks world or coming from the evidence and research world, with activists and artists and neuroscientists, tech experts, those who know about computational propaganda, communicators, even ad agency people and marketing people. And there I really saw the role that the work that think tanks do can really contribute to narrative change. The first one is, especially when it comes to a situation where there's an overwhelming phenomenon that is being experienced by social change activists, think tanks can provide the analytical framework by which to construct narratives. An example I have is this thing called closing civil society space or shrinking space, or how else do we call it? Shrinking civic space, which nobody really understands, especially not my mother. When it first was diagnosed like 5-7 years ago, activists, people like me, were simply seeing it as a set of disparate attacks against us, against civil society actors around the world. And what we were doing was what we were always used to doing. There's an attack in the newspapers calling us criminals. We respond by saying we are not criminals. There's an attack saying this and that, and we respond. Or there's an attack in the form of us not being allowed to register as an NGO, and we go to courts to challenge the law, or we lobby in Congress to propose a new law. So it's like a tit for tat way of responding to the situation. In my think tank role, tried to do was to provide an analytical framework by which to make sense of all of this, because without that, you really cannot come up with a long-term positive narrative that doesn't just counter or respond to messages, but comes up with an alternative narrative that you want people to talk about, instead of just reinforcing the message or the framing that your opponents are putting forward. So we said, okay, all of these attacks actually mean this. These are the fundamental flaws in the way that civil society has worked historically, which means these are our weaknesses. And what does that mean to the way that not only we communicate, but that we exist in the world? So this, like what Isabel said, is really a question, is a deeper question of power, a very deep socio-political context that requires analysis that activists normally don't have time or bandwidth to undertake. So that is one thing that think tanks can really provide. The second one is really evidence. There's a lot of talk now about evidence-based social change communications. It might be obvious to a lot of people in this forum, but it still is not obvious to a lot of activists we work with. We work with NGOs. Right now, we're doing this process with Isabel and Thomas in Myanmar, with NGOs there. We've done this in Eurasia, in Venezuela, in Hungary, etc. But evidence still doesn't figure well enough, or as it should be, in the process of constructing narratives. People assume that they know their community. People assume that they know their public. But in fact, that assumption is based on what we know or what they know of their community without really listening. There's no studying of the audience, and much less is there a testing of whether a narrative strategy has actually worked. So there's no evidence before, there's no evidence during, and no evidence to test narratives. And this is where the evidence that think tanks produce is really useful. In the narrative labs that I mentioned earlier, we had people coming in giving human rights activists neuroscience insights to tell them what you're doing is wrong, or this is an opportunity that you're not taking advantage of. We had someone from, say, the Center for Media and Social Impact at the American University, which really put forward there the importance of comedy in social change and comedy in narrative building. Or we've had people who just basically give the social political analysis of the context that is not easily available or is not first instinct to people working in activist circles. The final piece that I think think tanks can really play a crucial role in is not only providing evidence, but providing activists like me the skills to gather that evidence ourselves. So in the labs that we came up with, people came up with really cool ideas of new narratives and campaigns that they could run. But before actually going out to deploy those ideas in the real world, again, when we told them, you have to pause and do research first and test your messaging with a smaller subset of your audience. And people are like, how do I do that? Well, you can do focus group discussions, you can do surveys, etc. Things that are really easy for think tanks. This is something that you do for a living, but something that is not really part of the repertoire of many activists, often because of lack of time and resources. So being able to provide the analytical framework, the evidence, and the skills or the methods to gather that evidence and come up with that analytical framework is something that think tanks are well placed to provide in narrative building.
Thank you very much, Krizna and Enrique. Really interesting points. I think actually it would be quite good to just dive into discussion, because you've also got some other interesting, some very interesting people in the room who've obviously got some obviously additional thoughts. I will just put out again the questions, just to sort of remind us that what we're trying to think about is very much, well, we've touched on the barriers a bit about think tanks and research centres, but actually, do we think, the two speakers here have spoken about, they think that there's very much a role for think tanks and research institutes in doing this, but are there any others out there that feel alternatively about that? And yeah, how can we get better at doing this? How can we take this forward and move opportunities on? Now, I know in the room we've got Aidan Miller, Thomas Coombs and Laura Hankin, who we've been talking to a little bit separately about this and have been involved, and they're also, Aidan and Thomas are both authors as well in the series. Sort of hear what they thought first up, and then we will move over to others that want to pitch in as well.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, thanks. Like a really interesting conversation. I think it's high time that we were having this conversation. So we're really glad for Isabel and think tanks and Caroline and everyone to be convening this. In terms of do I think there's there's a role for think tanks? I mean, we set up about 4 years ago. I'm from Cass from Clare, by the way. For people who don't know me, we're a communications agency, and we set up about 4 years ago. In the wake of the Brexit vote in the UK and the election of Donald Trump in the US, not from a partisan point of view because we wanted to take a side, but more out of concern for the fact that we felt that we believe in in evidence-based policy, and we thought that somewhere along the way we've kind of lost, the political system had lost its way, and was no longer providing input from evidence-based policy, and that to us was a big concern. And we I think it's an oversimplification to think that it's because all of a sudden we lost interest in in evidence. I think in part we've probably got ourselves to blame for when around half of the population, and I'm obviously kind of generalizing massively here, but a significant share of the population, I'd suggest not just in the US but in most of our countries here, are no longer really valuing as much the input of evidence-based policy expertise. And so I think when such a big share of the population is no longer engaged with evidence-based policy, then I think we've got we need to be asking questions of ourselves, of about how we let it get to this point. So, do I think there's a role for think tanks? Absolutely. I think what we've witnessed over the last few years has been an assault on evidence-based policy, and the basis of which evidence, the institutions on which evidence-based policy rely, and so if nobody's going to make the case for evidence-based policy, or if think tanks aren't going to make the case for evidence-based policy, then who is? Quite frankly, and so I think it's about time that we started maybe focusing a little bit less on communication strategies, which are based on facts and reports that we know actually have limited effectiveness, and we actually started talking in terms of in the language that the people who we want to be engaging with at society, at societal level, talking in the language that they actually can engage with and understand. So that's a very kind of a high level view on that, but I might hand over to Thomas. I can stop rambling for now.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me on. It's really interesting point so far. As a person who's been a communicator most of my career, I feel like I have spent most of my career arguing with experts and lawyers to try and make what they're saying understandable to everyone else. And so the narrative, working on narratives being part of that journey, but it's been quite interesting, some of the reactions that I get from policy and legal experts. One of the most interesting ones was when we were encouraging people to talk about values, they said, what about truth? And so one of the really important things I think, and I think it's been said, is that no matter how neutral we think our facts are, everyone, it's not, there's a right-wing communications expert in the States says it's not what you say, it's what people hear, and that we have to accept that we're never neutral in what we produce. I think Enrique said that very well. And it reminds me actually, I rediscovered, I'd totally forgotten, but from my master's thesis on human rights, I actually wrote, trying to be like a controversial student, I compared how the human rights movement reports on human rights abuses to how the British Empire ruled India. And based on this idea of knowledge being power, and the people who produce the knowledge create power because their perspective becomes what is truth. And that was a little similar to how the UN human rights organizations operated. They document the human rights abuses without necessarily acting on them. And I feel like that's where narrative can be so powerful, that this sense of what's common sense, like Isabel mentioned, can be used to just dismiss bold ideas for change. Like if you look at how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez puts forward ideas like the Green New Deal, you'll see experts just really, first use just misogynistic arguments, but really just dismiss her arguments without really engaging with them by just saying, oh, this is silly, it's so unreasonable, it's so naive. And so I think perhaps what think tanks need to do is just actually be honest and open about the values we're trying to promote when we do our work, rather than claiming that we are neutral arbiters of truth. There's a great book by Rutger Bregman called Humankind, where he shows how so much of economic theory is based on this idea that human beings are rational actors, and to act rationally is to act selfishly as an individual, but actually anthropology shows that human nature is to act in a group and take care of each other. And that completely subverts all the economic thinking that's meant to be neutral and scientific, on which so much economic policy is based. But actually, if you think about how human rights operates, it's not that different. It's based on the law and legal theory, and most of our solutions right now are about punishing people. So if someone violates human rights, they should be prosecuted, they should be punished. Yet when we actually make the case, say, against the death penalty, we say there's no evidence that the death penalty is a deterrent to crime. We know, for example, that most domestic violence and other kind of violence happens in the home between family members. And so punishment is not actually the most effective way to deal with it. But yet a lot of the way human rights people operate is still based on legal theory, which assumes that humans are rational actors. We actually take the emotion out of it. And so in general, that our field, and I think a lot of the work Kriz has done has tried to address this, the human rights field has done very little to learn from psychology and neuroscience. We're trying to improve human interaction, but we don't actually take into account how humans actually function. So the summary there for me is, I think, another reaction I had when I spoke to human rights researchers, suggesting that our role shouldn't just be to point out the problems, but actually to show how we think things could get better. They said, Thomas, if we talk about solutions, what happens if they're wrong? What happens if the solutions don't work? And so there seems to be a resistance for us to actually put forward where a vision of where we want to get to and some ideas for how to get there. And so I think that's something that's desperately needed. I think on the communication side, actually, I can't do that much to change the narrative unless we're producing bold ideas, visions like the Green New Deal to put forward an alternative picture of where we can go. And the key thing is so many think tanks in the world, particularly on the right, they have this veneer of being neutral, but they're actually just producing material to prove their political point. And so I'm not saying that other think tanks should be cynical, but let's be honest about the values we're trying to pursue. And I think what would really help there is progressive values like, say, kindness, empathy, compassion, shared humanity are things which right now feel kind of naive and soft. It feels hard to put them in the political space on the same platform as security or economic growth. And that's, again, I think something that we need think tanks that bring together those kind of so-called soft values, but drawing on neuroscience and anthropology, it shows actually that's human nature. That's how humans work to take care of each other and actually have more policy thinking based on the reality of how human beings operate. And so, yeah, I think that think tanks could play a really major role, but the starting point is to say, we're doing this because we want to achieve X value.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Thomas. Laura, do you want to add something in before we move back to the rest of the group?
Yeah. Can people hear me okay? I can't tell on this at all. Perfect. I'm so used to Zoom. I think that's a problem with everyone now, isn't it? It's a different platform and no one has a clue. But I'm not going to add much more because I'm aware of time. And I think actually what everyone else has said has been really valuable to the conversation already. But perhaps unlike what Thomas has been suggesting we should do in terms of suggesting things and solutions, I'm actually going to just offer a couple more questions and things to think about. Because I do think one valuable element of research and researchers, and I'm coming more from an academic research point at this point, although I do work for an organisation, Roy Amos at the Allegor, who has a project at the moment looking at narrative change together with the Organisation for Identity and Cultural Development. But I do think there is a role for research as a critical friend and as a means of asking those critical questions that Kike was mentioning, but also Thomas and Aidan have mentioned just now around ethics. And I think one of those is we've all talked about narrative as being power and political, actually, with a small p, really, and something that is a social construct. And I think within that, we've already touched on who decides these, who constructs them. But I'm just gonna throw it in there as well. In discussing this previously around narrative, the example of Cambridge Analytica comes to mind as to who and how these things can come about, who has the role of making changes. And I think Krizna sort of raised a good point in terms of how we look at what the impact of the change is, but also what's it fundamentally based on. And I think it is values, and we do need to look to that. And just coming back to the Cambridge Analytica side, there was a lot of questions around how that was done ethically or morally. What was the bit that went behind it? How was that information collected, and how was it being done behind the scenes? And so I think that really emphasizes again this idea of open communication and how we're doing it. But I think the key thing is within all of this that we're not objective. We're not trying to produce something rational in this as researchers taking part in it. And we can't be doing it completely separately from the reality of what's happening. Narratives are about framing how we see the world, and we can't be doing that solely from looking maybe slightly more from the outside, as one could put it. But it needs to be a conversation between everyone. And the only thing that I think hasn't been mentioned really so much with narratives at the moment, but it reminded me when Thomas was talking just now about what people hear. And it is around listening, but I think it's around emotions. We've got to remember that it's something that comes from feelings. And how we tap into that is not something, and we all know this whole thing of the fall of the expert and evidence, and that it's not being looked to at the moment. And I think we just need to come back and think about how can we tap into emotions and feelings, and where is that important, and actually not only to change them, but also recognize and value them so that we're not dismissing narratives, but recognizing where they come from. But with that, I think I'm going to leave it for others to move forward with the conversation.
Thanks so much. I'm just also drawing, looking at the chat, as there's quite a lot of activity over there. I don't know if everybody else on the roundtable is having a look and wants to speak to any of the questions that are being raised. And I just want to touch on something that Laura said, which is there are many ways to change narratives, and something that we explore a lot in the 2 volumes of Narrative Power and Collective Action. There is, like in any emerging system, a dominant approach, which is sort of more akin to the Cambridge Analyticas of this world, but perhaps on the sort of socially good end of the spectrum. Socially good, obviously, being a construct as well. But there's also a huge, and we're seeing this across the world at the moment, you know, the narratives that were holding many systems in place really coming undone at the seams because of the collective mobilization of people who have just kind of had enough of existing within that kind of invisible web of factors that were keeping things in place. And so I just want to share that as a kind of a reflection on, you know, thinking about how do we achieve narrative change. And I'm wondering if anybody wants to actually comment on any of the questions that were raised in the chat. So there's a sort of a question around measurement and measuring narrative work. I've shared 2 frameworks that I think are useful. It also raises for me a question of, like, who else has analytical frameworks and where have those analytical frameworks been shared? Because that seems to be, knowledge sharing is a real kind of, I think, a big gap in this area of how do we share the kind of analytical frameworks that we're using to understand the way that narratives are shaped, and how we can maybe reshape them. I wonder if anyone wants to pick up on that question. Silence.
Pick up on something else as
yeah,
well?
go for it, please.
Or
yeah,
want to rain on that? No, so there's a question by Katerina, really good questions, by the way, on the problem of collective action. I suppose what you mean by that is like doing narrative change collectively or collaboratively. If I'm in, that is also the big questions that we're trying to crack everywhere, at least. So in the narrative labs that we ran, all these great ideas and people who want to work together. And I've been in spaces, including with Brett Davidson of Open Society Foundations and different funders, where they gather different narratives experts around the world. And they were asking the question, how do we not end up overlapping our initiatives and risk losing impact? And people are like, yeah, we have to work together. But when it comes down to actually operationalizing that, it's very difficult because people have their own programmatic focuses, and you secure, people are very protective of their independent voice, etc. But we all know that for narratives to actually change, to change the way we see things in society, you can't have tiny voices here and there that are not coming together. And I've put forward in that meeting and in a few spaces the idea of, can we work together like an orchestra, where everyone is playing a different instrument, you play the way you want to play it, but together we make one music. And somebody said, an orchestra is too directive, and who's going to be the conductor? How about we do a jazz band? It's more free flowing. And I'm like, whatever, jazz band, orchestra, it doesn't matter, but highlighting the fact that we need to sing to the same rhythm. And I think that's a challenge. I don't have the answer yet. I do know that more and more actors, especially funders, are trying to pour in more resources to try and solve that. But I don't know how it is in the think tank world, if this is even a remote possibility, collective action and narrative change.
Which I think that's very interesting. I was just going to say, that it's very interesting because actually, if you look at the publications, if you look at everything everyone's been talking about, collaboration seems to be the kind of the word that everyone says, everyone's talking, but yet, and maybe that's the bottleneck that we need to focus our energies on more. Perhaps that's the problem. And I know I've spoken to others working in this area who've said exactly that. That we almost need to do some narrative work within, the sort of the actual within the workings, that kind of internal communication, organizational development stuff actually needs to happen here more. But anyways, Enrique, you were going to say something now as well.
Yes, I think it's a general comment. I have a feeling that there is this view that think tanks have not been involved in narrative creation change, or they're not involved enough. And I think it's probably because the way think tanks have worked historically has been mostly through inside track approaches to influence, right? So it's more about working directly with individuals in power, whatever they are, right? Through private events, through projects, through advice, etc., etc., etc. But think tanks have been, core, key participants in the development of many narratives around the world that affect us today. And I was sort of emphasizing what Thomas was alluding to. So narratives have this sort of incredibly long shelf life, way more than a single policy recommendation that might be discarded after a few tests or considerations. We have this narrative of the World Bank coming into Latin America and imposing a structural adjustment on us. But the World Bank worked with, many think tanks and research organizations in Latin America as they developed this narrative that we accepted or was imposed on the rest of the public. But it wasn't a completely sort of external process. And it wasn't a process in which think tanks play absolutely no role. They played a key role, providing the evidence to legitimize maybe a decision made, sort of developing kind of a local community that would accept these ideas and would create this sort of local version of the need to have much more efficient government, etc. So I think think tanks have been doing this for a very long time, but I think that they just haven't been thinking of this as narrative formation, narrative change. And here's why I think this is important, is because I think, one, other narratives are affecting them, and they probably have not thought about how these things have been affecting them. But two, I don't think they've been thinking about the long-term consequences of developing these narratives, right? And again, as the final point, a lot of think tanks tend to be staffed by economists, or people who see themselves as technocrats, people who see themselves beyond, these sort of big ideological discussions. And so they see themselves as being able to solve a problem. There's a problem here, I'm going to solve it. And then the problem is solved, and I move on to the next problem. They do not think that their actions, the way they work, whether they influence in private or publicly, the choice of research agendas, the choice of research methods, they don't see how that has a lot to have more anthropologists and sociologists and philosophers in their staff to let them know, by the way, these things you're pushing for, by calling the state inefficient, this is going to have a long-term consequence in the way people perceive the state and the role of the state, 10 years down the line, when we don't have a strong state to support us, when we have a new pandemic. Well, it's going to be the consequence of you, bashing the state 10 years ago, saying inefficient, you have to be smaller, you have to be, don't get involved in anything, we need a much bigger private sector. So this is not about think tanks not involved. I think think tanks are involved, but I think it's about making them aware of how involved they are and the consequence of that involvement.
I know Aidan wants to say something.
Sorry, that was too long.
No, it's all good. But I think I want to connect what you're saying, Kike, to what Aidan has talked to me a lot about in the past, of this idea of how, and coming back to this disconnect between policy worlds and reality, and this idea of think tanks being staffed by the elite and not being connected to the real realities of people. I don't know if this is where you wanted to jump in on as well, Aidan, but just to ask that question of how did we get to a point where this anti-expert narrative was so popular, and what can we do about that? Because that feels like a sort of a barrier for a lot of think tanks to enter more into this space as well. Please go ahead, Aidan.
So yeah, so a few things on that. I guess first of all, like we talk about and this somebody at some point in these conversations always ends up making the point. So I'm going to make it on this occasion. We talk about think tanks as if they're kind of like a homogenous group of kind of and there's obviously like a lot of diversity within this, and so like the sense in which the think tank sector is engaged in narratives, really varies. And I think, for example, that there are some, in particular in the US, who've been very, openly engaging in narratives, from, the Heritage Foundation to, the Cato Institute, to, in the UK, organizations like, the Institute of Economic Affairs, for example. These are, typically, or the think tanks who were very open about the values and what they stand for. And typically they tend to also be the ones who, incidentally, most effective, at, actually affecting, the narrative. On the point about collective action, which as Krizna was saying, I have to say I'm of the school of thought that I'm comfortable with it being a jazz arrangement. I think if we if we wait for to try and establish harmony in message across all all organizations, this is never going to happen. This is a recipe for inaction. So for me, it's narratives, that we need to recognize narratives have they're not neutral. They have a direction of travel, right? And so for me, it's more if we want to change narratives, it's more about making sure that organizations and think tanks within the same kind of sector ensure that they're kind of vaguely pointing in the same direction. Beyond that, I'm quite happy with kind of a diversity of messages, etc. Because eventually, if enough organizations and enough voices are speaking up and and pointing in a different direction to what the prevalent narrative is, the direction the prevalent narrative is usually going in, then eventually the direction of travel will shift. On on your issues, Isabel, of how we got to that point. I'm conscious of time, and this could be the topic of a whole other conversation. So yeah, quite happy to have a chat about that over Twitter if anyone's interested.
Fantastic, thank you so much, everyone. I mean, this has been a really fascinating topic. I mean, I think we've all. I've heard everybody in the room I've heard nobody saying that think tanks and research institutes shouldn't be doing this, which is probably a good point. And I think, to this point of that it's actually not something particularly new, what Enrique was kind of saying about this has been actually going on for a long time. Perhaps now we're just putting a different label on it and we're actually thinking about it more, and we're trying to build it more openly into our work. And that think tanks really do have a very strong analytical role to play. We need to get in there more. We're thinking about emotion, values, power, to ensure the balance of and the role of the think tank is important to that. And finally, I guess collective action and collaboration really is I feel like that's sort of the big central point that people are coming back to. We are all human beings, and working together is never an easy task in smaller, larger groups. But I think that's something perhaps to be discussed more. So thank you very much for your time. And this is certainly the beginning of discussions around this. There's a lot more of meaty stuff in this great topic. Thanks, everyone.